Hello, Kathy again, and we're back to begin assignment 4.2. We're starting with the collages that you made in 4.1, and the first step is going to be to make sure that your collage is in the form of a JPEG. If you did a magazine collage, you will have photographed it, and photograph it, of course, and save it as a JPEG, and you're already there. If you made your collage in Photoshop, you will have a Photoshop document, a PSD. This has many layers, it's a heavy document, and so the first thing we want to do is simplify it down to one layer and save it as a JPEG. So in Photoshop, please go to the Save As command, choose a name for this if you need to, and I'm going to save mine in a, let's see, a folder here that works for me. And I'm going to go down here to Format and simply choose JPEG. Save. You may get a little dialog box telling you that you need to save it as a copy because the layers will have to be flattened out. And what you're going to get then, I'll open the Layers window on this JPEG, is that there will only be one layer. All those many, many layers for every image that you had before will have been collapsed into one layer, and the file size greatly reduced. And this is what we want as we move into Illustrator. Okay, you can close Photoshop now and open Illustrator. I'm going to open in Illustrator a new file. There's no template for this assignment. You're simply going to work in a normal A3 document. If you don't see that on your screen when you open it up, simply go to Print and look for A3. This one happens to be set up in points. You can set yours up in inches or whatever you like if you're more comfortable with inches or millimeters. It doesn't really matter for this particular assignment. We're going to simply tell it to create a document. I want mine to be vertical, of course. You may want yours to be horizontal. There we go. I have a new document open. It is as yet untitled, and in this document I'm going to place my Photoshop JPEG or scanned JPEG, depending on how you did the collage. So instead of using the New or the Open command, I'm going to go about halfway down here to the Place command. And this is a convenient way for Illustrator to accept a file that is a bitmap file, more like a Photoshop file would normally be. We're going to get a browser window. We're going to navigate to the file that we just saved, and there it is, my Baroque JPEG. I'm going to place it. Now when you place a file, you get a little critter that looks kind of like a postage stamp, and I'm going to tell it, yes, I want one corner of it to intersect with the corner of my existing file. And now you'll notice that it doesn't fill my file. This is an 8.5 by 11 file. This, or image rather, this is an A3 file, which is considerably bigger. So I'm simply going to take this corner anchor and drag it down to the edge here. If you're having trouble dragging, it may mean that you've somehow lost your black selection tool. Make sure that you're using that. It normally opens when you use the place command. And I think I'll command minus to zoom out so that you can see that the whole image exactly fills the file. Now one little thing that you will notice is that once again, my critters have gotten a little bit elongated. My file is stretched out just a bit. I've chosen the 8.5 by 11 format since I think that's a convenient size to make your collage, especially if you're working with magazine photographs. But I want the A3 format because the amount of detail that you may put into this is best seen when you print this out at a larger size. The 8.5 by 11 and the A3 format are not identical in proportions, but they're so close that I think you'll probably find it isn't a problem. If the elongation, either horizontally or vertically, depending on your file, if that bothers you, you may crop it a bit by distorting the proportions this way, for example. But remember that anything that you drag beyond the outlines of your file will not print, right? Okay, so here we are with our collage in the A3 file. I'm going to open the Layers window at this point, and I recommend that you keep this window open the entire time that you're working. Kind of live with this layers window. It's going to be, I'm going to get rid of this one and move this over here so that it's conveniently out of my way but where I can reach it. If your layers window is tiny, like this, you can stretch it out so that you can see the different layers you're putting in, and you're going to have a lot of layers here rather quickly. Let me introduce you to the layers window first of all, and you'll kind of help you find your way around in here. Each layer as it goes in is by default given a numerical name. You can change the name by double-clicking, just as in a normal Finder file. And instead of calling this layer 1, I'm going to call it something that has meaning for me. I'm going to call it collage, because I'm going to try not to draw in this layer. I'm going to keep this layer at the bottom of my file. Now you will see that this layer is really just a file folder. This little caret here means that there's something inside, and what's inside is the image. So this part here is the layer. This is just like a file folder in your Finder file. And this is the treasure inside, the image, the actual placed image that you got out of Photoshop. Let's put this layer, collapse it again so it doesn't get too big and unwieldy. And with that layer activated, which we do by clicking it and turning it blue, we're going to go down here to the Create New Layer button. We're going to click that, and a layer 2 is going to come in right above our layer called Collage. I'm going to double click this layer and name it Rendering, because this is the layer in which I plan to do all the drawing that I'm going to do. Now if I do all the drawing in this one layer without organizing it in any way, I'm going to have an awful lot of stuff in this layer that will be very, very hard to find. And if I want to, say, take all the shapes that make up my gorilla, or all the shapes that make up my sky or my pots, I'll have to pick them out one by one, and it might be very tedious. So within this layer, which I have activated now, I'm going to create a sublayer. It's called layer 3 by default, but I'm going to call this layer, I think the first thing I'll draw on my picture will be this door, because it looks really, really easy. So I'm going to name this sublayer Door. I'm going to now activate my rendering layer, and I'm going to make another sublayer, which I'm going to call Sky. You'll notice that I'm following the instructions, which we found in assignment 4.2, of creating big, simple shapes to organize my composition. So I'm going to call this shape Sky. Double click it and name it Sky. Let's do some drawing in the door and the sky layers before we go any further. I'm going to activate the door layer, and I'm going to grab my pen tool. I'm starting with this layer because it's so easy. First of all, I think I'll take my black selection tool and unselect the image so that we don't get any funny effects here. And I'm going to go up to about where I think the corner of the door is. I'm going to click, and that's going to be an angled anchor point. I want my door to continue all the way down behind the gorilla, so I'm going to click here. Now I have a fill on this shape I'm drawing, and I already think I'm not going to want a black fill here. I think I'll just take the fill off for now. I'll click None. I'm going to go across here to about where I think the door might end. I'm going to go up here to the top. I'm going to go across here to where I started. See the little 0 at the lower right of my pen cursor? I'm going to click now, and I will have a closed shape. Now I'm going to take my black selection tool, make sure that shape is selected if anything has gone wrong, and I'm going to give that shape a fill, just as you're asked to do in the instructions. I obviously want to put a lot of details in that shape later on, but right now I'm just going to give it a value fill. And I'm going to go to I'm not seeing the fill swatch windows here because I'm in the wrong workspace. So just in case this is happening to you, I'm going to go into the Essentials workspace here so that I can find my swatches. The swatches will appear in several places here. I'm going to go under brushes and click swatches. Again, make sure that my fill icon is in front. I'm going to drag this down until I see the value scale here, and I'm going to pick a value that seems to be about right for the door. Maybe something like this. Let's give that shape a fill. Something like that looks good. Okay, I'm going to make the swatches go away for a bit now so that I can work with my layers. Now, of course, my gorilla has disappeared, right? But I can always take the visibility off that square if I want to see the gorilla. Let's go to the sky folder now. We'll call it a folder. You'll see that this is just a layer right now. There is no image within it, whereas with the door layer, there's an image there. There's a path. Very simple rectangular path that I just drew with a pen tool. All right, let's go back to the sky layer now, or sublayer rather, and we're going to, again, click on the pen tool and create the sky. I'm going to go right up to that anchor point there, click on it, and I have a gray fill now, and you'll notice, I'm just going to leave that on. You'll notice what happens if I leave the fill on. As soon as Illustrator gets a chance to kind of make it look like that fill is filling up my image, it's going to. I'm waiting to see the little zero. I'm clicking to get my shape, and I'm going to say that fill is too much like the door. I want it to be a little bit lighter. How light do I want it to be? Oh, maybe 3 or 4 steps lighter, I'm thinking. So I'm going to go get my swatches, give it a fill about, oops, I don't have it selected. There we go, I lost my selection somehow. We're going to give it a fill about like that. And is that perfectly accurate? Perhaps not. The point is, when you're done with a step of assignment 4.2, I want every shape to have a fill. Now, of course, I've got to draw the gorilla and the obelisk, and I can't see them. So I'm going to turn the visibility off in the door layer and the sky layer so that I can see to draw the gorilla. I'm going to go back to rendering because that's the layer I want my sublayer to go into, and I'm going to click the Create New Sublayer button, and I'm going to call this Gorilla. The Gorilla sublayer is going to be a little bit more complicated to draw. I have to draw it on top of the door, and that's going to be a final edge, right? So I might want at this point, especially if I have access to a graphics tablet, which you'd have access to if you came into the lab at Green River. So if you have access to a graphics tablet, I do recommend trying at least the pencil tool. For my money, the pencil tool and the pen tool are the same tool. And although your instructions say over and over again to use the pen tool only for drawing your shapes, the pencil tool qualifies for me. Command +++ here to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to simply start drawing my gorilla's shape. You'll notice that I'm not taking care to draw it quite perfectly. I'm zooming in here, and now I'm going to continue with this by first clicking on that anchor point that I'd like to continue on, and then in a separate click starting to draw. When I let go of my pencil tool, you'll see that it's leaving, of course, the very, very same anchor points and paths behind it that the pen tool would have used. And I could continue this with the pen tool. In fact, let's do that so that you can see how this works. I'm going to select the pen tool, and I'm going to click on that first anchor point to let it know that I want to continue there, and then I'm simply going to continue. And with the pen tool, of course, I lay the anchor points point by point, and I'm going to click and drag on each one here because I mostly want these to be smooth anchor points rather than angled anchor points. Again, though, if I don't get them exactly right, I'm not getting all persnickety about it, to use a word my grandmother was fond of. Okay, that seems to me that the pencil tool is going a lot faster than this, and I want to make this snappy so that I can get you guys working on this on your own. So I'm going to go back to the pencil tool, click the anchor point I'd like to use to continue on, and then simply draw around here. I think I'll make the skirt a separate layer, and so I'm just going to draw around the actual outlines of my gorilla rather rapidly here. Whoops, click on that to start again. Let's see, click, I'm forgetting that I'm using the pencil tool instead of the pen tool. I'm going to zoom, or I'm going to move up here. Since I'm zoomed so far out, he has quite a hairdo on him, this gorilla. Okay, and when I get back to my first little anchor point, you'll see that tiny 0 up here, and that means my shape is closed. I'm going to zoom out now. Sorry for how long that took, and we're going to give that shape a fill, just as we did with the other two shapes. Again, my gorilla has some beautiful chiaroscuro, some very bright areas, some very dark areas that get almost black. I'm going to just sum all that up, though, with one simple value. I'm going to go to my swatches here, and I'll say that my gorilla, I'm going to make it a little bit lighter than the door, perhaps. Shape a value about like that. Let's turn the value, or the eyeballs, back on in the door shape and the sky shape here. And I've got my gorilla maybe a little darker than the sky, a little lighter than the door. Something like that works. Now, of course, I'm going to go back in and draw the skirt. I think you guys are getting the idea. One thing I'd really like you to see, I'm going to zoom out a little bit here, is that you don't need to draw complicated outlines in every shape. So for example, with the door, I knew that I could paste it under like a piece of construction paper, right? I didn't need to draw the complicated outline between the door and the gorilla when I drew the door. I just made a big layer that went underneath. If, for example, you had started with the gorilla and happened to draw the door on top of it, you could simply, I'm going to just use the gorilla here, you could simply drag the gorilla around. I've dragged the gorilla underneath the sky here, you'll notice. Let me select away, and you can see that now the sky has come in front of the gorilla. I can drag the gorilla underneath the door, and which I don't want to do, of course. So I'm going to Control Z those last two rearrangements of my shapes. And rather than tediously go around and draw each of these critters again, we'll move to a version of this assignment that has everything drawn in so that you can see rapidly how to organize your layers and work with them as you continue. One thing I would like to note is that I drew the pen tool / pencil tool line very, very quickly and roughly. I would like to go back and edit that and make it a more accurate line. I'm not going to go into how to do that in this lecture, but there is a pen tool demonstration lecture that goes into that in much more detail. So after you've learned how to draw your shapes and organize them in layers, I hope you will go on and look at that video and learn to use the pen tool very quickly and efficiently, because you are going to be using it a lot in this assignment. Okay, so here we are in our Illustrator file that's carried a lot further. This rendering is still, of course, not anything like complete, but I've put enough detail layers in to give you an idea of how to organize things. So let's just take a look at the Layers window here. Remember, you can open this by going to Window and clicking on Layers if you don't have it open already. As before, we have two basic layers: the collage layer, which has nothing in it but the linked file, which I've placed in there, that photo collage from Photoshop, and then the rendering layer, which now has a lot more stuff in it. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or so basic shapes. The basic shape of the pots, the obelisk, the gorilla, the stove, the door, and the sky. Now, you don't have to organize your piece by image like that. So, for example, you may have a very large, dark area that is part of a figure and part of a negative shape, and you can make that one of your basic shapes if you like. For me, it seemed a little easier to organize mine in terms of the images, a nice, simple way to do it, and that's how many of my students seem to choose to work. Let's unpack some of these layers here. Let's unpack the gorilla, first of all, because I think that one is the most complex. In the gorilla sublayer, which is a sublayer of rendering, we have the gorilla's body and we have the gorilla's skirt. So I put one of my basic shapes, instead of making it a layer unto itself, I decided to organize it by making it a sublayer under the gorilla sublayer. These are sublayers. And nested under the skirt sublayer, there are two sublayers filled with highlights. One is primary highlights and one is secondary highlights. Let's take a look at these. I'm going to open up the little caret next to secondary highlights, and you'll see there's a whole bunch of little paths that don't have individual names. I'm going to select one here, and you'll see as I select it in the layers window, it becomes selected over here in my file. As I select another one, you can see them jump around here. Let's select this one, which is fairly large, and you'll see that the secondary highlights are paths that I drew to show the areas where some light is hitting the fabric. Then on top of those secondary highlights, I made another layer, or sublayer rather, of primary highlights, and let's see if we can select this one, and you'll see that selection works the same way, but reversed, of course. If you select something in your file here, the selection is indicated in the layers window. This is really, really handy when you're trying to find things. So for example, if I wanted to figure out where one of these little critters is in the file, like if this is the one that I know I want to darken or lighten a little bit, but I don't know where it is, I can select it in the window and immediately see it come to life over here. So what I'm trying to show you is that this is a very, very easy way of organizing and finding things. It's also a very good way of seeing through your rendering down to the image, because in order to draw a layer like this highlight layer that I drew on my gorilla here, I have to be able to see the photograph of the gorilla underneath. So I can see the photograph of the gorilla by turning off the entire rendering. But when I do that, I can't draw in these individual sublayers. I can't draw in anything that has its visibility turned off. I can't alter it in any way. So although it's very convenient to take a quick look at my whole collage and see if I'm getting the general idea of it by clicking that one eyeball, it's also very convenient to be able to turn off, say, the door layer. Let's find the door layer here and go into the gorilla layer and turn off the visibility simply on one path. I might turn the visibility off on this path here. This is not a layer, but an actual path. And I can turn its visibility off, and I can still draw within the gorilla's body layer. If I turn off the visibility on these two paths here, the one, I'll select it so you can see it, the one that shows the light coming down the left side of the gorilla, and here's the one that shows the light coming on the gorilla's hand, right? If I turn off the visibility on those layers, I see right down into the collage, and I can easily draw. Now, if I turn off the visibility on this whole sublayer, I will not be able to draw. Say if I want to go in and put the gorilla's eyes in, or her nostrils, or her mouth, or anything like that, I won't be able to draw on that layer if I completely turn off the visibility of the whole layer. However, I can achieve the same thing simply by turning off the visibility of the paths that I have drawn in those layers. Then I can draw another path. If I have the body sublayer activated, it will go into that layer. One thing that happens to me a lot when I'm drawing is I start drawing and I forget to think about which sublayer I'm in. So I'm working on these beautiful eyes or something like that, and suddenly I look up and I realize that they went into the pots sublayer or the stove sublayer. And it is very, very easy to fix that. Let's put the visibility back on everything here. Very easy to fix that by simply opening the layers up and moving your path from one to the other. You can move it into any other sublayer you want. So if you're organization falls apart a little bit, or if you forget what you're doing and things get disorganized, if you find that one sublayer is inside another and you didn't want it there, you can always drag it out. It's very, very similar to organizing your files in a Finder file, documents and so forth, in a Finder file on your desktop. Another thing that I want to show you, let's open up the skirt sublayer. Another reason that it's very, very handy to have all these sublayers organized like this is that you often want them all to have the same value. So for example, all the primary highlights here have the same value, and if I want to change that value, if I decide that I'd like them all a little brighter, instead of tediously selecting each one and shift selecting another one and so forth, I can simply click on their layer and everything in that layer is immediately selected. I'm going to zoom in here, Command plus plus plus, and you'll see that there's a whole bunch of little primary highlights that are selected right now. I can go to the swatches here and I can adjust them. I can make all these adjustments simultaneously and keep the whole system consistent. Same with secondary highlights here. Let's collapse the first highlights and open the second highlights. I can select them all. Right now all these highlights have a blur on them, both the primary and secondary. I can change that blur by opening the appearance window for the selected objects, and you'll see here that they have two different instances of a blur put on them. I can click one of those and turn the blur down, and the blur goes down for all. Whoops, let's click the preview so you can see that happen. The blur goes down for all of the instances that I have selected. I'm going to cancel this because I don't want to really lose that blur. I could change their opacity. So you see that having things organized that way will really save you a ton of time when you come to making decisions, especially about things like blur and opacity, things that you'll be learning about more in the lecture on atmospheric perspective that is coming right up. Let me just quickly show you how you could turn the opacity of all of these layers down, of all of these objects down here, all these paths that I have selected. And again, that's something that you might want to do at the end to fine-tune your values and to make some shapes and objects melt into each other for lost and found contours. So I hope that gives you a good overview of how to use the layers window. If you choose, you can put each of these in a first rank layer, each of your primary shapes. I like them as secondary layers because I really like to be able to just take one click and toggle off the visibility of my entire collage. An alternative to that, if you prefer to have these all as first order layers, an alternative would simply be to keep your collage open in a tab next to this one so that you can click over there and see it when you want to and then click back to your own piece. And I think I've noted that in the assignment as well. So my own preference then is to just have two primary first rank layers and to have everything else be nested sublayers, and I recommend that to you. So we'll look in the next lecture a little bit more at how you're going to get these kind of soft edges, regulate value in order to give the most convincing feeling of three-dimensional space as you bring your pieces to completion. One of the best things that you can do is to look at the student samples that I have put up in resources, and these will give you a lot of ideas about ways that very creative students in the past have approached this project and the kind of energy they've brought to it. I expect you to astound me just as much. Okay, have fun as you lay in your primary paths and use them as an organizing principle for the entire file. You'll be adding detail sublayers to each of the sublayers that contain your primary paths, and you'll be toggling off visibility in order to see down to the photograph collage underneath. I really look forward to seeing what you're going to do, and I'll be seeing you again very shortly for the lectures on pen tool mastery and atmospheric perspective.